You're sitting at the kitchen table with your disabled sister when fire suddenly erupts from her mouth and stomach like a dragon breathing flames. You throw water on her, but she just sits there calmly, hands folded, not crying out in pain. She doesn't understand what's happening to her body. Neither do you. Neither does science. I'm Carol Ann. Welcome to the InBetween. I softly opened the door and looked in, and the burning smell is there, and the soot is there, and the oil is there, and he is not there. That is a line from the serial novel Bleak House by Charles Dickens, where he kills off one of his main characters in a very unique way. Spontaneous human combustion, when someone bursts into flames and is literally cremated with no apparent cause. Confession time! I have been fascinated by this topic since I was a kid. I have this flash memory in my head of a movie on TV in the 70s where they showed a split second of a woman's burned, disembodied leg on the floor of a bedroom. But that's it. That's all I remember. And I'll be the first to admit that what I see in my head might be a total figment of my imagination. For all I know, I might have just glimpsed an advertisement for Legs pantyhose. But whatever I saw, it has stuck in my brain to this day. So I gotta say, I'm kind of excited to finally cover this topic and maybe exercise the memory that's been living rent-free in my head for decades. Now, obviously, spontaneous human combustion, which I'm going to refer to from here on out as SHC, is not a common occurrence. Even Charles Dickens took a lot of flack for using such a rare and scientifically unproven method for disposing of a character. But make no mistake, even in 1853, spontaneous human combustion was prevalent enough that it was already being investigated in the circles of medicine and science. And through all of this time, a few commonalities have been identified. Things like advanced age and heavy alcohol use, and maybe even diabetes. We're going to dig a little deeper into how those things fit into the big picture later, but suffice to say, there are some factors that we can point to that are somewhat common in this very select group of people. But before we dive into the hows, let's take a look at the who's. Let's talk about the cases we know about to see if we can get an idea of what is happening here. And just to let you know, there are so many documented cases of this phenomena that it was really hard to decide which ones to cover. But let's start with what is probably the most famous case of SHC. Mary Hardy Reeser was a 67-year-old widow in St. Petersburg, Florida. The night of July 1st, 1951, she tells her son before he leaves that she's just going to take a couple of sleeping pills and go to bed. He says goodbye and leaves, not having any idea that it would be the last time he would see his mom. The next morning around 5 a.m., Mary's landlady smells smoke. She goes to open Mary's door, and the doorknob is warm. She grabs a couple of neighbors, and they get into Mary's apartment only to find a pile of ash, a few pieces of spine, a shrunken skull, and one of Mary's feet still in its slipper. That's a weird one. And the whole scene was just weird. Her apartment didn't really have a lot of damage, mostly just the chair she was sitting in and, to a much lesser extent, the floor under her. Things like light switches and outlets higher on the walls were melted, but things closer to the floor were not. But everything was covered with a greasy coating. Mary was a known smoker, but fire investigators were stumped at how her body could look like it was cremated. That process takes 2 to 3 hours at temperatures of 1800 degrees or more. Samples of Mary's remains and some of the items around her were sent in for analysis, but no accelerants were found on anything. But Mary was far from the first case of SHC. Documented accounts go all the way back to the 1400s. An Italian knight by the name of Polonius Vorstius is hanging out with his posse one night in Milan around 1470 or so. Takes a couple of swigs of some unusually strong wine, which his stomach didn't appreciate, and he reportedly starts vomiting fire and bursts into flames. Then there's 66-year-old Countess Cornelia Zangari di Bandi, an Italian noblewoman from Cesena. The night of March 15th, 1731, she's not feeling so hot. She takes a bath with camphorated spirits of wine, which is basically camphor dissolved in alcohol used for pain relief from aches and pains and sprains. And before you start thinking, it's the alcohol, slow your roll. The alcohol would have evaporated within minutes of her getting out of the tub, so it's not likely to have set her on fire. She gets out, gets dressed, and goes to bed. In the morning, she's found on the floor as a pile of ashes, her head, and her arms and legs. There's Matilda and Patrick Rooney, a couple living the simple life on a farm in Seneca, Illinois in 1885. Christmas Eve, the two are having a drink with their farmhand, John Larson, before they all head to bed. The Rooneys on the main floor and John upstairs. In the morning, John comes downstairs to see a pile of ashes and the feet of Matilda on the kitchen floor. He runs to the couple's bedroom to find Patrick dead of smoke inhalation. There's the case of Jean and Nicole Millet, who in 1725 in Reims, France, are running an inn. Nicole's legs and a pile of ash are found in the kitchen one morning, and Jean is convicted of murdering her. However, when Jean appealed his conviction, Dr. Claude Nicolas Lecat, a surgeon staying at the inn, testifies that based on the remains found, it was definitely a case of SHC. So the court acquitted Jean and ruled the incident a visitation from God. And there are way more that I can't even get into, all through the last 400 years. Depending on who you ask, there are somewhere between 200 and 400 documented cases. So what in the world is happening here? Obviously, no one knows for sure, but there are some interesting theories out there. The most popular one is something called the wick effect. Basically, it states that given an ignition source, so something like a burning cigarette or an ember from the fireplace, and an accelerant, that Jack Daniels you accidentally spilled on your lap, that can start a fire burning long enough to burn through your clothes and your skin and start using your own melting fat for fuel to keep it burning. So you essentially become a human candle with your own fat as the wax and your clothes acting as the wick. The theory's been around since at least the 60s, if not earlier, but it wasn't until the late 90s that experiments were conducted using a pig carcass wrapped in a blanket and doused in gasoline that showed the wick effect in action. The pig burned for 6.5 hours and reduced 60% of the body to ash, including the bones, all while causing minimal damage to the room. Okay, but not all cases fit those parameters. A newer theory emerged in 2011 from a guy named Brian J. Ford that point the finger at acetone. Acetone is a highly flammable chemical available in most households, most commonly as fingernail polish remover. Now, I'm not saying these people are taking swigs of fingernail polish remover. That's not necessary because we can actually make acetone all by ourselves. Conditions like alcoholism and diabetes or low-carb diets can move the body into a state called ketosis, which is where the body switches from burning glucose for fuel to burning ketones from stored fat, which also produces acetone. Oh, maybe I need to start eating more cake. Yes. So his theory is that if someone builds up enough acetone in their system, that acetone could build back up into their fat stores again, making those fat stores much more flammable. Okay, decent theory. The only problem is that the experiments Mr. Ford conducted were on pig flesh that he marinated in acetone. Of course they're going to ignite. But there's no science to show that acetone levels in stored fat can ever get high enough to make a difference. But okay, we'll hold that one in our back pocket. Well, my favorite theory is from Larry Arnold. Larry came out with a book called Ablaze in 1995 that went deep into the whole SHC phenomena, reviewing around 200 cases of SHC and interviewing witnesses, firemen, and survivors of their own experiences. The theory he introduced is called the subatomic pyrotron theory, better known as the human Hiroshima theory. He suggests that SHC happens because a hypothetical subatomic particle called the pyrotron, kind of like a neutrino, exists within our bodies. On rare occasions, it collides with a quark in an atom, sparking an internal chain reaction like a mini nuclear explosion, consuming the body from within like a human Hiroshima. Well, that's certainly a novel idea, but stick around because maybe it ain't all that crazy. Like I mentioned earlier, there are some commonalities between most of the victims that we know of. Most of them are over 60, so maybe they're not moving as quickly as they used to. In some cases, the victims are known to have had mobility issues, meaning that if they did start on fire, maybe they were not able to get up and do anything about it. In most cases, alcohol is involved, which, based on the current theories, could be either an accelerant or the genesis of acetone in the system. Also, a lot of the victims were smokers. Not to dunk on smokers, it's just a super easy ignition source. Okay, so the case that is being built is that you have an older person who maybe can't move around that well. They settle into their favorite chair for the evening with a glass of their favorite spirits and either a smoke in their hand or a fireplace at their feet. As they relax, they either fall asleep, pass out, or maybe even have a medical emergency that causes them to either drop their drink and their smoke or not notice when the fireplace spits an ember. In either case, that starts a fire that the person maybe can't get away from. And because of the nature of this particular kind of fire, that it's very hot but very local, not much damage is caused except for the immediate vicinity. Sounds totally plausible, and it does seem to cover a good chunk of the cases on record, but not even close to all of them. There are plenty of cases that can't be explained by any of these theories, except maybe the human Hiroshima theory. Take baby Raul, who lives in India with his family, mom, dad, and an older sister. I say lives just to let you know up front that little Raul is alive and well today. Don't worry. In 2013, when Raul was just 9 days old, his mom, Rajeshwari, rushes him to the hospital with burns all over, telling the doctors and nurses that he just started on fire. She says he was totally fine, laying in his crib. She leaves him to care for her other child when she hears him start screaming. She doesn't rush in right away because she's still tending to the other child. I mean, she was just in the room with him. She knows he's okay. But before she can get back to him, the neighbor rushes in to let Rajeshwari know that little Raul is on fire. The neighbor saw it through the window as she was walking by. Raul's doctors try to figure out what could have caused the outburst of flame, but the best that they can come up with is that maybe his skin is emitting some strange flammable gas. It's a wild guess on their part, but whatever. However, wild or not, Raul actually starts on fire 3 more times over the next 2 years. No one can figure out why. Then in 2015, Rajeshwari rushes back to the hospital with Raul's 10-day-old new baby brother, whose feet supposedly caught fire. Now, keep in mind that Raul has a big sister, Narmatha, who has been totally fine this whole time. But I'm sure at this point that you're probably thinking what I'm thinking. Munchausen by proxy, right? When a parent, usually the mother, intentionally harms her child so she can benefit from the intention. Well, we're not the only ones to think that. So did the hospital staff. They didn't really want to let Rajeshwari take her new baby home, but she and her husband went through a battery of psychiatric tests that showed that they were normal people. But I will tell you this. Munchausen by proxy can sometimes be tricky to diagnose. So if in this case that's actually what's going on, it failed. Instead of getting attention and sympathy from their community, the entire family is ostracized. An even better example of not fitting the mold is the case of Robert Bailey, a 33-year-old homeless man living on the streets of Lambeth, London. Like the homeless often do, Robert took refuge in the abandoned building at 49 Auckland Street. On the morning of September 13th, 1967, some people are standing at the bus stop waiting for their ride to work when they see blue flames in a window of that abandoned building. They call the fire department, who rushes into the building to see Robert still alive with blue flames shooting out of a 4-inch slit in his stomach. To put the fire out, the firemen literally put the hose into Robert's stomach. Needless to say, Robert did not survive. He did fit some of the rough parameters we've talked about so far. He was a raging alcoholic, but he was only in his 30s, and the fire investigators couldn't find any external ignition source. I would call that a human Hiroshima. Another one I find extremely intriguing is the story of George Mott. In 1986, George had recently retired from a 30-year career as a fireman in Crown Point, New York. He lived alone and was kind of depressed about the current direction of his life as he was just put on oxygen for some lung issues he was having. 30 years of running into burning buildings. Imagine that. His son Kendall would usually stop by each night on his way home from work to make sure his dad was okay and spend a little time with him. On the night of March 24th, George and Kendall were watching The Twilight Zone. It has been reported that George told Kendall, "Nothing weird like that ever happens to me. I wish it would. Be careful what you wish for." The next night, March 25th, Kendall had to work late, so he didn't stop at his dad's. So he made sure to stop the night after that, walks up to George's door, and the doorknob is warm. He knows there's a problem. He walks inside to a house full of acrid, metallic-smelling smoke. Everything is just black with soot and a greasy substance. Even the windows were all browned out, making it hard to see anything. Kendall calls out for George with no response. It was hard to see anything, but Kendall makes his way back to his dad's bedroom to find his dad's bed a pile of ash sunken down to the floor. The fire department comes and starts investigating. Now, this guy was one of their own, so they are determined to get answers. The scene inside the house is just odd. The bed that George was lying on and the floor below it are totally gone. There are just a few pieces of George left, including his lower right leg and his skull, which seemed oddly small, just like Mary Reeser's skull. But the fire seemed to selectively damage other parts of the house. The water in the toilet had evaporated. The butter and the plastic butter dish it was in were totally melted, and a package of hot dogs was boiled in the plastic, and that's inside an insulated refrigerator. None of them can understand how the fire could have been that hot, but not ignite the whole house. They go through that house with a fine-tooth comb and get nothing. They could find no reason for this fire to have started. Now, George's oxygen machine was turned on, but George was not wearing the mask that goes with it. George used to be a smoker, but had quit and never allowed anyone to smoke in his house. He even made his son go outside to smoke. Joe Nickel, the editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, puts forth the theory that maybe George's depression led him to start smoking again. But I don't buy that for a second. This guy had been a firefighter for 30 years and no doubt knew the dangers of smoking in a room with an open oxygen tank. That's not rocket science. One thing we can at least partially explain is the weird pattern of damage throughout the house. While in many of these stories, things on the floor right next to the deceased are just fine. We all know that heat rises. So when a fire starts, it creates a column of heat that hits the ceiling and then starts to spread outward. Once it's gone as far out as it can go, it starts going down and heating the air under it. But that intense heat rarely makes it all the way to the floor. So things that are sitting 3 or 4 feet off the ground may be melted while books on the floor are not. But whatever happened to George that night, the entire Crown Point Fire Department will tell you it was not an accidental fire caused by a careless old man. Another case that blows the Wick effect theory out of the water is the case of Jeannie Saffin. In 1982, Jeannie is 60 years old, but is mentally disabled, so she lives with her dad. On the afternoon of September 10th, Jeannie and her dad, Jonathan, are just hanging out at the kitchen table when Jonathan sees a flash out of the corner of his eye. He looks over in that direction and sees fire coming out of Jeannie's mouth. Jeannie's brother-in-law, Don Carroll, is there that day, hears a racket coming from the kitchen. He goes in to find out what's going on and also sees fire coming out of both Jeannie's mouth and her stomach. He describes the scene like every fire-breathing dragon movie you've ever seen. Dodging the flames, Don Carroll gets a pitcher of water and puts out the flames. Jeannie doesn't even cry out in pain. She just sat there with her hands in her lap, not able to understand what had just happened to her. Who could? She's taken to the Mount Vernon Hospital burn unit, but sadly dies 6 days later. Skeptics say it was Jonathan, a pipe smoker, who must have been knocking the ash out of his pipe when a stray ember was blown on the breeze of the open window into Jeannie's lap. But Don Carroll says, no way, that fire was coming out of her mouth. The coroner's report says there is no evidence of burning at the back of Jeannie's throat and that she suffered burns over 30 to 40% of her body. But according to Larry Arnold, remember the guy with the human Hiroshima theory? Both Jonathan and Don Carroll stated to the police that the entire inside of Jeannie's mouth was burned, but those police statements are not mentioned anywhere in the coroner's report. And if Jeannie's case doesn't qualify for the human Hiroshima theory, maybe this one does. The case of Helen Conway. In 1964, Helen was a 50-year-old widow living alone in her home in Darby, Pennsylvania. The morning of November 8th, Helen is upstairs while 2 of her grandchildren are downstairs. Her daughter had dropped them off the night before so she and their dad could have a date night, and the plan is for them to pick the kids back up later on Sunday. Helen has trouble getting around, so she spends most of her time on the second floor of the house and rings a bell if she needs any help from the kids. Around 8:30 that morning, her granddaughter, Stephanie, heard Grandma ring the bell and ask her to bring her a book of matches. Stephanie brings the matches to Helen, who's a smoker, and goes back downstairs to her cartoons. A passing neighbor sees a glow in the upper window, runs to the house. Stephanie lets her in, and the neighbor tries to go upstairs, but by that time the heat is so intense she can't get up there. She calls the fire department somewhere around 8:50 or 8:55. When they arrive and enter the house, they run upstairs, but there's no fire to put out. Helen is just gone, save for a few bones and her 2 legs. It is actually not just common, but almost universal that the only things left are feet and hands. The wick effect actually accounts for this detail in that the extremities usually carry less fat. So once the fire spreads that far, there's not enough fuel to keep burning. So is this one just a case of Helen dropping a match on her lap and starting herself on fire? If that's the case, why wouldn't she have made any noise? You'd think that she would have screamed out to her grandchildren for help. But Stephanie, just downstairs watching cartoons, never heard anything. Now, a lot of the furniture back then was made of some pretty combustible material. So if she did drop a match on herself and the fire spread to her chair, it very well could have gone up in flames pretty fast. But that doesn't account for Helen's body being reduced to ashes in just a 20-minute window. Cremation usually takes 2-3 hours at temperatures of 1800 degrees. This fire had heat. There certainly was damage to items all over the top floor, but the heat necessary to turn Helen to ash would have created far more damage than what investigators actually found. But here is the most intriguing of our cases today. Someone who actually survived. Frank Baker is a decorated war veteran who lives in Vermont. In June of 1995, Frank and his friend Pete Wiley were sitting on the couch at Frank's house getting ready for a fishing tournament the next day. They're having a great time when Frank bursts into flames. Frank and Pete manage to put out the flames and get Frank to the hospital, where Frank's doctor tells him that the burns look like they came from the inside out. Frank and Pete were just sitting in the living room, sorting out their tackle boxes and putting new line on their fishing rods. They weren't smoking. There's no fireplace, no ignition source anywhere. Unfortunately for the scientists who study this phenomena, but fortunately for the rest of us, cases of spontaneous human combustion are pretty rare. So they just don't have the data necessary to figure out whether we're dealing with the wick effect, spikes in acetone levels in our fat layers, human Hiroshima syndrome, a combination of all of them, or something else entirely. So my advice to you would be, don't smoke like a chimney, don't drink like a fish, and eat cake. Man, I could use a piece of cake right now. Or even a cocktail. Why does everything good have to be bad? If you would like to continue this exploration in the weirdness of this world, join me in this episode right here. Come on, it'll be fun. Be careful out there. And I will see you here again on the In-Between.